Welcome back to Kapowich on Real Estate. This is a program dedicated to consumer protection within the residential real estate arena. We have back in the studio real estate attorney Shawn Parr. Shawn, thanks for coming out.
Good evening. Thanks for having me.
Shawn, we've had you on the show many times. I've seen you speak at the real estate boards. You were kind enough to join us at De Anza College for our seminars there, I think a couple of times. And one of the programs that we did at De Anza College was on distressed properties.
Mm-hmm.
And you have made several points that when these families come into you and sit there and say, we're trying to hang on to this house, and they're basically ruining their lives month after month, year after year to hang on to the house. So we're going to start with the distressed sellers in these distressed properties.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess the best way to go through it might be to talk about maybe a philosophy I have or when I'm talking to these people. And the challenging part, especially being an agent and especially for the seller, is usually when you're dealing with your home, whether you're buying or selling, it's a very happy time. Because you got the new house or you're selling the house to get another house. These are times when it's not only stressful, but very financially pressing. And so a lot of times when we're under those conditions, we don't make the best decisions. Right. And that's where trying to treat the individual in the situation, a lot of times it's a husband and wife, and there may be different attitudes or ideas about what to do. So you have to look at all these different situations. I think it takes a lot to look at whether or not it's in their best financial interest to keep the house, especially if the house is upside down by more than $40,000, $50,000. Sometimes I see houses $400,000 or $500,000 upside down.
Oh my gosh. Now upside down is also underwater.
Upside down, underwater, whatever you want to call it, it's not good. And basically what that means is the loan is greater than the equity of the property. Right. We're seeing the banks do loan mods. I have seen principal reductions. I have seen that going on. But I have to say the times I've seen them have been fewer and farther between than the times that the banks say no to that. Mm-hmm. And so what I try to do is when I'm counseling my clients, I try to always look 3 to 5 years out. And my theory is if I can leave my client in a better place in 3 or 5 years than where they are today, then I've done my job. And one way we do that is we get a pad of paper and I'll sit down. And the interesting thing is, Pat, it's so much easier to counsel somebody than to look at it yourself. And so what I'll do a lot of times is I know in my head they can't afford the house. But if I tell them,
you can't afford the house.
You don't like being told what to do, right?
Right.
So if I tell them, you can't afford this, you need to sell it, you need to do this, it turns bad quickly. So what I'll do a lot of times is I'll work with them on a budget. And it sounds silly, but we go through it. And it's always interesting to see how much gets budgeted for what, because a lot of times the husband will say, well, how much you spend on groceries? And there'll be a family of 4 or 5, and they'll say, oh, we spend about $300 a month on groceries. And I'll be, right. And then the wife will pipe in, and we get a number, and so we go through that entire process just to see how much they can afford. And at the end, usually, it may work out in the situation of being $600,000 upside down. It may work out that they just can't afford the house. And then we look at alternatives to not only living arrangements, but how to divest themselves of the house properly, not to cause any future liability.
I see.
I also am a firm believer that it's okay to rent from yourself. And what I mean by that is, let's say the house is $200,000 or $300,000 upside down. You may get a loan mod that reduces your payment down to $2,000 or $2,500 a month. If your entire living expense to live in your house is $2,500 a month, and you can go rent a house across the street identical for $2,000 a month, when you take into account your after-tax consequences, right, because you get to file Schedule A and deduct interest, all that stuff, your $2,500 may equal 17 or 18.
Right.
Depending on your own situation, of course. In which case, you're better off to stay in your own house and pay that payment, even though your house is so far upside down, it's ridiculous. But again, I try to help them understand and go into it eyes wide open as to the fact that you're renting from yourself. The American dream of making this payment for so long and paying it off, yes, you can do it, but that's not the normal way that we've seen, and it may be 12 to 15 years before you're just at the point where you don't have any equity.
Okay, that's a good point, because they could rent the same house nowadays, depending on the area, for $3,500. So they need to keep that in mind as well.
Exactly, and that's where making those decisions is tough, but again, I think everybody views the value of their house at its highest point.
There you go.
Right? So how much is your house worth? Well, one time, I'm like, not one time, today. And then unfortunately, I think you and I discussed this at one of our past shows, was the loan fraud era drove home prices. The banks allowing the 100% financing and the no income qualifiers, that actually drove home prices higher, because we got into a situation where people weren't buying homes based on value. They weren't going to quality agents. How much is that house worth? And you'd say, well, I think it's worth $400. Okay, let's bid $390. They were going into a mortgage broker, and the mortgage broker is saying, you can live in a beautiful home for $2,500 a month. And so all of a sudden, even if the house was only worth $400, they were bidding $480, $490, $500, because they weren't buying the house, they were buying on payments.
Correct.
Which is what a car dealer tries to get you to do, not a guy selling a house. So then all of a sudden, of course, it was a bad loan, and $2,500 turns into $5,000, and then here we are today. So a lot of times, that house that is worth $500 when you purchased it was really only valued at $4. So when it's down at $3,
you shouldn't be surprised.
It may only go back up to $4, because that was the true market value, not the $530 you bought it for. And so it's things like that that I just try to assist people in getting an awareness as to where they're at.
Okay, now when you mentioned about getting them out of the property safely, or something to that effect, we are speaking about, they often have a first loan, a second loan, and there is the mortgage debt relief that we had the last recession.
And it's here today too.
Okay, and the debt collector. So people, the family, the distressed family has to go through the process of losing their home and the financial humiliation of that. And then down the road, they might get phone calls from bill collectors saying, hey, you still owe us from that house.
Exactly. And so the other thing we do a lot of bankruptcy at the firm too. And one thing, again, I think people come and see an attorney or an agent based on, I have a problem with my house. And they come running in, help me with my house, help me with my house. And then I'll ask them, well, how much do you owe on credit card debt? About $90,000. Well, and medical bills, we owe $20,000 to a hospital. Okay, how much a year? $75,000 a year. And you're like, let's talk about your house, but what are we going to do about all these other challenges that we have? And so, again, assisting the individual in kind of an overall plan is a much better way of doing it. You're right. If you took a refinance out on your home, what we see now that's happening, and it's mainly on refinances where you took cash out or even just got a rate in term, meaning you just lowered your payment, but you didn't take any cash out. If the first goes through a foreclosure, the first will take the property back, and then the first is made what we call an election of a remedy, and the first can't come back after you for any more money in California. Okay? Okay,
so that's the first lender, first loan.
Correct, in what we call a non-judicial foreclosure. Now, the second, you borrowed $100,000, let's say, and you signed something called a promissory note, right?
Uh-oh.
Yeah, a promise. And as we learned in kindergarten, you're supposed to keep your promises, right? So when you sign that promissory note, the note was secured to real estate. Well, it's no longer secured to the real estate because the first mortgage took the real estate, and then as we learned, it wipes out the lien. Just because it wiped out the lien doesn't mean that the person that signed on the promissory note isn't still held to their promises to pay the note back. Now, that's not true in every situation, but we're seeing a lot more of that. And that's when the second lenders then will come after the people for collecting on that money.
And oftentimes those second lenders who were wiped out during the foreclosure, they wait a year or two for that family to get back on their feet.
Or 3 or 4 or 6 or 8. The statute of limitations is 4 years.
Oh my gosh.
But it can be extended based on certain terms of the note. So it's a lot longer time frame than what you would normally think.
Now, oftentimes they turn this over to a collection agency or attorneys that specialize in debt collection.
Correct. Okay. And so we don't really know where that's going. Now, the government has put in laws regarding short sales, where sometimes a short sale will help you with that. If the second lender agrees to the short sale, then there's a law that prevents them from collecting on a deficiency.
If they agree.
If they agree. And then also just reviewing your short sale paperwork, it may turn out that they also release. The big words to look for are release, reconvey the lien, that kind of a language to where they're not going to collect any more money from you.
Okay. This is a good point because real estate agents can get in trouble at the kitchen table, where they're called out to their kitchen table, they're just working with the distressed sellers, and then start working with the banks and get a buyer and go through the sale and find out, oh, we could have avoided some problems here.
Well, and that's a big challenge for a lot of it too, because again, you've been an agent a long time. Usually when you're at that kitchen table, it's a happy time. And here we are in a situation, imagine being a seller where you have to clean up the house for showing, make your kids clean their room,
Right.
Get rid of the pet in the backyard that's barking because it scares the people away, deal with the open houses, deal with the escrow company that sometimes forgets documents where you have to go back and sign again, and then when your house closes, how much money do you get?
Nothing.
Nothing. So it is a very challenging time to deal with all those things, and that's where it is important that people go look towards an attorney, a CPA, somebody that understands all of this, if their agent isn't in tune, to be able to explain all their different options.
Okay. Now, because the California Association of Realtors does promote that agents, their realtors, should counsel that we are just doing the sale. If you need tax advice, you should seek out counsel, not only from an attorney, but from a tax person. So the reason they're doing that is because of the ramifications.
The significant ramifications, and also liability back to the agent. I mean, obviously, to be a successful agent, you want to have happy clients, and it's hard to have happy clients if you advise them one way when it turns out the law is totally different. And the law is changing all the time because our government has put in many stopgap measures to help people, and they're constantly expiring and being put in again, and expiring and put in again. So you got to stay on top of all those different items. And even myself, I practice a lot in the tax arena also. I'll send people out to the CPA because it's very difficult regarding tax issues if you don't know the individual. For example, I had somebody that, because of one of these situations, I thought was going to have about $100,000 tax ramification. The only time the tax ramifications truly come into play are for the people that own property for a long time, borrowed a lot of cash out of it, took cash out of it, so it went up, and then the property came back down again, and then either the short sale or the foreclosure happens. So now you have true capital gains, plus you have the 1099 debt relief. That's a bad situation to be in. 95% of the people that have a foreclosure or a short sale don't end up paying tax on the 1099. Okay. But you have to talk to your CPA, and there's the Mortgage Debt Forgiveness Act, there's insolvency, there's a million different ways to get rid of that tax. But in this one case, I thought this person had to pay $100,000. So here I am, giving them the bad news, but I say, you know what, let's call your CPA. So we end up calling the CPA. I didn't know that they ended up having what's called a loss carry forward from some stock problems they had 3 or 4 years ago. So as it turns out, we were able to sell the property, and they took that other loss and was able to offset the 1099. So
Perfect.
It's important, though, but I would have never known that. And I would have never known to ask the questions. And even if I was smart enough to ask the right questions, I don't think my client would have known the answers.
Exactly.
So it's important not only to send them to a CPA or to an attorney, but if they have somebody that they already do business with, it's really good to get their advice on those types of things.
Okay, because during the last recession, which was also sparked through the S&L crisis and real estate fraud, is when we're speaking about that 1099, that mortgage debt relief. So in other words, they go through the foreclosure or the short sale, and then they think they drove into the sunset, and all of a sudden they get a 1099 in the mail.
Right. So just briefly about that, the 1099 is what we call a 1099-C, okay, and it's the cancellation of debt. And it's what we call phantom income. And what we call as phantom income is because did you really get anything? No. Most 1099s, as you well know, if you made $50,000, somebody may give you a 1099 for $50,000 to tell the IRS, hey, I paid Pat 50 grand, right? And our tax system is set up with the premise that if you're going to get money, you got to pay taxes. But the idea, like a W-2, like a paycheck, you get some money, they take some money out. So you get paid, you pay tax. In phantom income, we saw this with the stock option issues.
Right.
With phantom income, you got income, but you didn't get any money. And so the IRS provides ways where, for example, if you're insolvent, if you don't have any assets, if you don't have any real estate, for example, they will not collect the tax on phantom income on this type of a gain. So there's ways around all that. Okay. It's just a matter of how you approach it. The concept is you owed $400,000, you went through a foreclosure, the house foreclosed for $300, and now you don't owe $400 anymore. So what happened? You must have made $100 grand somewhere.
Right, exactly. Mortgage debt relief.
There it is. And so like I said, most people don't have the problem because most of the people bought the house when it was really high, the values went down, and therefore they don't have the same problem that a lot of our other clients have where they bought the house low, it went up, they took a whole bunch of money out, they invested it, they went on vacations, then the property came down again, and then you have kind of this double whammy effect.
Now the short sales also, when a distressed seller needs to sell their house, and let's say the loan is at $500 and the house is worth $450. Now the family that, you know, the husband lost his job and the wife is working part-time and they've run out of resources. There's also the family that they both have great jobs, nice cars, 401ks, CDs, and, and the power to pay. So those, can you speak to the issue of what's, sometimes people are walking away from property on purpose?
Yeah, and I think we're seeing less of that. Walking away from their property, I tell people all the time, you know, sometimes doing nothing is a strategy, right? I mean, sometimes by not doing anything, that is a strategy you can take, but it's usually not the best strategy. In my practice, I try to avoid people walking away because you lose control over what's going on.
Oh, good point.
So I try to talk about short selling if that's what you're going to do. There are people out there that have lived in their home for free for 2 years or 3 years, and the thought of giving up that luxury of free living is a little more difficult to deal with, and so they may try to push out as far as possible.
Okay, now those are the people that stop making payments, and the bank hasn't foreclosed or repossessed their home yet.
Correct.
And word got out that I could just stop making payments and I could still live in this home.
And every situation is different.
Sure.
I have some properties out in the valley that I have clients that have lived there for 4 to 5 years, and I've made one payment, they're still living there.
Wow.
I have clients that stop paying within 2 or 3 months, the notice of default comes, and 90 days later the notice of trustee sale comes, and then the property's gone. So you don't want to plan that, but I think what you're getting at is if the seller has the wherewithal, it is a different situation than the person that can't afford it. But remember, I think Don Trump has filed bankruptcy 7, 8 times. I mean, there's nobody that says if you get into these bad real estate transactions that you need to continue to pay. Especially, let's say you just have a first mortgage.
Yeah.
If you're willing to let it go to foreclosure and you don't have any continuing liability and you want to make that financial decision, then you have the option to do that. And as my contracts teacher always used to tell me, you know, breaching your contract is not a moral issue. We breach contracts every day. Companies breach contracts every day. If I said to you, Pat, I'll pay you $100 to wash my car every week, and then we do it for a month, and then sometime halfway through you say, Shawn, I'm not doing it anymore because I'm going to go wash Jim's car for $300 a week. Well, you breached my contract, and I might be able to sue you for $200, but if you're making $300 over there, you're coming out $100 ahead. So realize people breach contracts all the time. I think the more interesting issue is the bank's perceptions of how they're handling short sales now. Yeah. If you remember 2 or 3 years ago, banks didn't like doing short sales.
Correct.
And then they figured out this whole foreclosure thing
is costing us.
It's costing us. And I've had plenty of houses I've seen that when the foreclosure happens, the $5,000 Wolf range, the new appliances, the doors, the $700 shower head in the master bath, they disappear.
Right.
And so when you fix everything up and all this, it's simpler to ensure that the short sale is for market value, let them short sell, and it seems to work better that way.
Now, you had mentioned about at one of our classes that when you have these sessions with these homeowners, distressed sellers, later they say to you, gosh, I wish I had done this sooner.
Yeah, that's more in the bankruptcy arena a lot of times. Yeah. I mean, I think...
Well, making a decision one way or the other.
Exactly. And a great example of that, I think I recall the class we were talking about, is when people basically dig into their retirement and their 401ks or their IRAs to fund the saving of the home. Okay. And the reason why that's so important is in bankruptcy we have exemptions. We're able to keep your stuff. And there's almost an unlimited exemption up to $1 million or something for 401ks. So if you have $500,000 in a 401k, if you can't afford your house and you keep taking money out of your 401k, paying penalties on it and all that, and then at the end you can't keep your house and you have to file bankruptcy, if you would have came in the beginning, you could have kept $500,000 in your 401k
untouched,
right, and still filed bankruptcy. Mm-hmm. So it's things like that that you just need to make sure, and that's where when you first start having problems, that's the time to start seeking help and getting over, I think there's a big stigma with the foreclosure and the short sale to where a lot of people are embarrassed or don't want to talk about it. And that's, you have to get over that. Because if you need help, talking to an attorney is confidential, all these different things, but you need to start getting advice now because planning things out will greatly improve what you look like financially 3 to 5 years later.
Okay, we had touched, we've talked about in the past about they are distressed and they're embarrassed and it's humiliating, and then they have to open their house up to strangers to sell the house. And a lot of times these listing agents will sell the house themselves before it goes on the market.
Correct.
Not a good idea. We need to put it on the market and get the full fair market price for that. Can you speak about that pocket?
Yeah.
What is a pocket listing?
A pocket listing is basically when somebody lists a house and doesn't communicate it to the MLS and to the world regarding what's going on, and basically tries to find a buyer within their office or within their friends, so that some agents do what's called double ending a transaction. And that basically means they're representing the buyer and the seller, and it truly just benefits the agent or the broker because they're getting two sides of the commission. The interesting concept in here, though, is it may cause harm to the seller, but in a different way than you might think. And what I mean by that is, in a short sale scenario, a pocket listing probably is not going to affect the seller as much as a regular listing would be in a regular selling situation. Okay, because if you're underwater, if you're 10 feet underwater, and some guy gets you only up to 8 feet underwater, how much better off are you?
Right.
The part that I think that harms people by doing the pocket listings in a short sale is that a lot of times the banks won't approve the short sale because it hasn't been marketed properly, hasn't been on the MLS. There's a lot of requirements for doing a short sale, and that's where having a good agent understand short sales helps a lot with that.
Because in the situation you gave where the bank is going to take the hit now.
Correct.
Where they could, if they put it on the open market, maybe they could recoup tens of thousands of dollars.
Well, the bank could, correct.
The bank, not the...
Right. And again, I'm a little biased.
Right.
But the bank, I'm not as concerned as the bank. I'm concerned about people.
Right.
And my point is, even if the bank loses 10 or 15, who cares? But what happens if, because of a poor agent's decisions in pocket listings, the bank doesn't approve a short sale, and then ultimately a foreclosure happens, and then ultimately a second deed of trust has recourse or liability back to the seller? That shouldn't have happened. The
consequences of a...
Correct. Again, it's a little more complex because it's not that normal. Because I remember in the very beginning, agents used to come in and try to sell that the seller should list the property for $800 because they think they can get about $780. The loan on it's $1 million. And my attitude was I'd call the agent up and say, what are you doing? Well, I think I can get an extra 50. I'm like, just give me an offer. Okay. Get me a contract. You know, if you got to list it for 7 or 6 or 8, you know, get a buyer. Because the client, the true client, is not getting $1 at all.
Yeah. So the main thing, if they're a short sale, they have to open their house. Because oftentimes I see a lot of times, even if they're on the market, they say by appointment only, no lockbox, boom, boom, boom. We need to get bodies through there.
Yeah, and it depends on the market and where the house is and how it's priced and all those kinds of different items. So it's challenging. And again, in my practice is looking towards the client and how I can best help them. And it's not dollars and cents anymore because they're not getting any money. It's avoiding liability, and it's getting the short sale done to avoid the deficiency, or it may be buying time in the house. I've seen short sales happen that have other value to it that normally isn't the same.
And we need to get this behind them sooner
good.
rather than later.
Yep.
Okay, and then closing cash for keys. What are cash for keys about? One minute.
That's basically when the bank comes to you and says, I've already foreclosed, I own the house, I'll give you $1,500, $3,000, $5,000 to basically move out amicably so I don't have to file an unlawful detainer, leave the house in beautiful shape, and we'll pay you money to move.
Okay, another reason why a distressed seller should not mess with their property.
Correct, and I've actually seen the district attorney go after some people that truly did destroy the property, because once it's foreclosed, they don't own it anymore, and so if you damage somebody else's property, then it is a criminal act.
There you go. Shawn Parr, the Parr Law Group in San Jose. Thanks again, Shawn.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for watching Kapowich on Real Estate. This is a program dedicated to consumer protection within the residential real estate arena. We will see you next week, same time. Thanks for watching.